The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Welcome back, everybody. Eric with you. This morning, what I want to do is do a podcast, kind of a follow-up podcast on our Fluidology 101. Had an email from a follower, last name of Adams, P. Adams, from Kentucky, and sent an email requesting that we do a podcast on Plasmalyte, Dextran, Albumin. So we're going to kind of try to do a podcast encompassing all those things. I'll hit on every one of those. Try to cite some studies. I'll post the studies in the show notes, and hopefully the podcast will be informative. I think based on my research regarding these different volume expanders, isotonic, hypertonic, hypotonic fluids, some of them are beneficial. Some of them really haven't been shown to improve outcomes. And, obviously when we look at outcomes, we need to be looking at evidence-based practice. Why are we doing something? If it's not been proven, if it hasn't been proven or shown to be beneficial, why are we continually doing it? Why are we looking at those things? So hopefully the studies that I put in the show notes, you'll be able to read those, check those things out, make your own opinions on. Just want to start off and just say thanks so much for just the massive increase in listenership. I continually am in awe of how the podcast is growing. As you probably know, you've seen the advertisements. You saw the podcast plug that I put out of the new podcast called Second Shift with my good buddy Mike Verkest. Has had a great response. It's been really, really fun. So if you haven't checked that out, please go on to iTunes and search that. If you have this podcast, the FlightBridgeED Podcast, in your podcast app, just search Second Shift. And please subscribe, leave us a feedback, hopefully a 5-star rating, and do the same for the FlightBridgeED Podcast. We have usually 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 downloads on each podcast, but subscribers on iTunes, and I understand everybody uses different platforms, but we've got lots of ways to subscribe. So if you could subscribe, leave some type of feedback, that would be wonderful. Allows me an opportunity to better the podcast and continually growing FlightBridgeED. If you're new to FlightBridgeED, I just want to say that welcome. You are among friends. This podcast is very practical. And for those of you that are new to the FlightBridgeED, start from the beginning, check out the introduction podcast, go through the different topics. I believe this will be podcast number 62 or 63. So there's lots of different critical care level podcasts related to everything you can imagine in medicine. So check those things out. Share this with a friend. And remember, this is all free. This is all free FOAMed education. And again, my goal is just to put out the best top quality information out there. So let's jump into the podcast. The first thing that we're going to look at is Plasmalyte and Normosol. And we're going to look at that and we're going to kind of apply that and compare it to LR and normal saline. I'm not going to dive deep into normal saline. We know normal saline, though, is a very acidotic fluid. It's got a pH compound of about 6.0. It's got a really high sodium of 154. It's got a high chloride of 154. And we know based on multiple studies that normal saline in massive infusion causes secondary issues. It causes that hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis, increases inflammatory response, aids in really causing poor outcomes. So we've learned that we want to limit the amount of normal saline, and we've learned in different aspects from burn care to trauma resuscitation to massive hemorrhage, things like that we want to limit the amount of volume, especially in normal saline, and we need to think about what fluids we're giving, right? When we compare that to LR, we have a sodium level of approximately around 130. It kind of depends on the literature you read. The chloride level is about 109. It does have a lactate aspect to it, and it's got an osmolarity of about 274. So when we look at that and we compare that to, let's say, Plasmalyte or Normosol, the sodium of Normosol Plasmalyte is about 140. It does got a little bit of a potassium in it. It's got a chloride level of 98, so that's much closer to our normal chloride level. It also has a gluconate aspect to it. It's got an acetate aspect to it. The big aspect with regards to this, the acetate and the gluconate, and looking at normal saline, looking at LR, is we don't want to cause a problem with our patients, right? We don't want to cause a worsening issue, as in metabolic acidosis. And that's why we kind of steer to a 1-to-1 as far as LR and normal saline, because of that potential. When we kind of compare that to Plasmalyte, and you look at the acetate, you look at the gluconate, the whole aspect of those two molecules or anions was that it was going to metabolize and actually form bicarbonate. Plasmalyte and Normosol are actually fluids that have a higher alkalinity. And so if you compare that with a fluid like normal saline, there's a huge difference, even bigger than a LR. So when they looked at this and they said, all right, well, we're gonna form a fluid that has a higher alkalinity, even more so than lactate. We're gonna add this gluconate, we're gonna add this acetate, and this is gonna actually metabolize and form bicarbonate. And obviously the bicarbonate is the aspect of homeostasis that we always talk about, where we have hydrogen ions and we have bicarb, right? We have both of those that kind of counterbalance each other to maintain homeostasis. Well, when we have more bicarb's a base, that's going to be an alkalizing agent. That's where they looked at this and they said, all right, we're going to add those two anions, so the acetate, the gluconate, they're going to metabolize when this fluid breaks down in the body, and it's going to help maintain more of a neutral situation. However, what they found in multiple studies, I'll put those studies in the show notes, that even though they contain the sodium acetate, the sodium gluconate, as their organic anions, and the belief was that this was going to metabolize and yield bicarb, that really didn't happen. Unfortunately, the actual sodium gluconate specifically wasn't even metabolized whatsoever, and it was just excreted out of the kidneys. And so, when they looked at this, they looked at the evidence, they looked at the outcomes. There was really no difference in Plasmalyte and Normosol in comparison to LR. So from all the literature that I've read, basically LR is simpler. It's obviously more of an alkalizing agent than normal saline, and we should just go with that. Don't fool with Plasmalyte, don't fool with Normosol, just use LR. In summary, when we kind of look at this and we compare this to LR is much simpler. Existing evidence indicates that Plasmalyte and LR are both superior to normal saline, but obviously we all carry LR, and LR is going to be kind of the way to go if you had to pick between a fluid. And again, there's really no evidence to show that Plasmalyte or Normosol are any more beneficial to volume expansion than normal saline. The next fluid I want to talk about is Dextran. And Dextran is a hypertonic fluid. So remember, a hypertonic fluid has a smaller amount of solute compared to volume. So when we look at that, we have to think about what that does in and out of the cell. If you have a higher amount of solutes, remember that free water or water is going to follow. So that's called osmosis. And so you have this volume that you're placing in, and we're talking about 3, 5%, 7.5% normal saline. So a high concentration of normal saline percentage compared to our normal isotonic fluid. So if you have a higher amount of solutes outside the cell, basically any water in the cell is going to always want to follow those solutes. And so you're giving a fluid that's going to actually pull volume from the cells. The cells are going to actually shrink, and you're going to pull all that volume that are intracellular into the intravascular space. So that's kind of one of the beneficial things, is you can volume expand somebody very, very quickly. Also very beneficial in patients that you have traumatic brain injury, where you're trying to reduce any type of edema or swelling. Normal saline in 3, 5, or 7.5% is used in that context. And we've talked about that in the past, that in specifically subdural bleeds, they give a 3% normal saline to try to increase that sodium level to about 150, 155 in the hopes to reduce the edema, reduce the swelling in the brain. So when you look at Dextran from the perspective of out-of-hospital survivability, a lot of times they use a 28-day survival endpoint. Many studies use that kind of that language, 28 days, 30 days approximately. And, although the argument continues over the validity of, using that 28-day endpoint, the different studies that I've looked at did show that hypertonic fluids improve secondary endpoints in both hypovolemic trauma and in traumatic brain injury. One of the studies I looked at actually had I think it was about a 3.9 increase in survivability when using a hypertonic fluid versus isotonic. And then obviously I already quoted that there was a twofold increase in survivability in a traumatic brain injury patient when using a hypertonic fluid in those patients. One of the interesting things, though, on the study, when you look at using a fluid, the patients that responded the best, they were giving a hypertonic fluid, so Dextran, as the initial volume expander. So that was the first fluid that they got, and then afterwards they could get their normal isotonic fluid. But the initial fluid bolus, the initial fluid volume that was given was always a hypertonic fluid, as in Dextran. The next fluid I want to talk about is albumin. Albumin is, as we've spoke of on other podcasts, this is a very important player in acid-base balance. Albumin is a weak acid. And if you haven't listened to those podcasts, I did a 3-part series on dominating acid-base balance, part 1, 2, and 3, back in March, February, March of 2013. You can go back on the app you're using, or just go onto the website and check that out. And I discuss how albumin actually plays into acid-base balance, how we convert that and turn that into an actual number that reflects acidity when you're kind of looking at a base excess and trying to identify if you have a negative number, what albumin is playing in that role of acidity or metabolic acidosis. But albumin can be administered in kind of two forms. It can be administered in a 5% solution, or it can be given in a 25% solution, and based on that solution is how that is going to be taken up by the body. So remember, we have isotonic and we have hypertonic. We just talked about hypertonic, and in a 5% solution, albumin is isotonic, so there's no shifts in or out of the cell. It's very neutral. There's an equilibrium there. In 25% solution, we are actually giving a hypertonic fluid. And so very, very important to know that you're giving a hypertonic fluid in albumin when you're giving that 25%. Now, based on the different books I've read and things like that, you can give this very, very slow, or you can give this very, very rapidly. It kind of depends on the patient. It depends on how they're responding, or really what's going on. Are they in massive hemorrhage? Are they a burn patient? So really that's going to be based on your local protocol and what your medical director wants you to do, if this is an option, if you do carry albumin or have the option to give albumin. So when we think about albumin, the whole point of albumin is kind of that Starling's concept, right? You want to have capillary balance. You want to have hydrostatic and oncotic pressure gradients across that capillary membrane that are equal. You don't want fluid or volume to be leaking out of that vascular or that capillary. Remember, we have what's called a glycocalyx. If you think about the glycocalyx, kind of think of it as finger-like projections. Think of it as your grass out in your front yard. And when we start having capillary leakage, we have a problem where we have this glycocalyx that's broken down. Well, the whole point of albumin is to maintain that osmotic pressure, to maintain that glycocalyx, so you don't have that capillary leakage outside into the interstitial space. Albumin is something that's actually distributed throughout the extracellular water. So more than 60% of our body's albumin pool is actually located in the extravascular fluid compartment. Okay, so basically outside the cell. Since the oncotic pressure of albumin, 25%, is about 5 times that of normal human serum albumin because of, again, that hypertonic aspect, it will expand the volume of plasma if the interstitial water is available for inflow through the capillary walls. So when we think about treatment of acute volume deficit, and you're using albumin 25%, you should always give an isotonic electrolyte like normal saline or LR in conjunction with albumin. And you want to do that in a ratio of about 1:3, 1:4. So for every 1 albumin, give 3 liters of normal saline or LR, probably specifically LR, based on what we've talked about in the past, or a 1:4 ratio. Okay, we've talked about Plasmalyte, we've talked about Normosol, we've kind of looked at that and made the assumption based on the literature and the trials, the evidence that really not beneficial in comparison to LR. LR is much, much easier to use. We carry this, so really that's something that's kind of debunked. We really don't need to be worrying about Plasmalyte or Normosol. We've looked at Dextran. Dextran, remember, is a hypertonic fluid volume expander. Obviously, in the military setting, Dextran is probably a better solution because they can carry a lot less, and volume expansion is really, really important with all the blast injuries and things like that. But really, when we look at that from the pre-hospital setting, again, 3.9% survivability when used in traumatic hemorrhage. And then again, there was a double increase in survivability when looked at and given in traumatic brain injury because of the hypertonic solution aspects of pulling that volume, pulling that edema off the brain, and reducing ICP. Okay, well, that's all we have for this podcast. Hopefully, just kind of looking at Dextran, looking at Plasmalyte, looking at Normosol, kind of comparing those to LR, kind of rehashing and looking at hypertonic, fluid volume resuscitation and kind of what the literature says. Like I said, I'm going to post the different studies in the show notes so you can check those things out. If you don't know where the show notes are, you'll have to actually go to the website. You'll go to the under the podcast. I'll actually do a blog post on this as well, kind of put the literature in a blog post. You can go to the blog on the website, www.FlightBridgeED.com. Check that out. Again, I want to thank everybody for the following. Remember, check out Second Shift with myself and Mike Verkest. Follow us on Twitter at FlightBridgeED or at Second Shift FBE for Mike. Again, Second Shift FBE for FlightBridgeED. And we will talk to you on the next one. Thank you.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.